Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where morning mist clings to ancient ridges like forgotten memories, certain family names are still whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror. Not the Hatfields or McCoys whose feuds made headlines, but older bloodlines whose stories were deliberately buried beneath decades of silence and fear. These are the clans who discovered that in the hollows where sunlight barely penetrates, where cell towers cannot reach, and GPS signals mysteriously fail, there exists a different kind of power, a power that demands payment in blood, sacrifice, and the surrender of one's very soul. The winter of 1847 changed everything for 5 families scattered across the remote valleys of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. Each faced their own desperate circumstances, their own impossible choices, their own moments of weakness when the darkness seemed to offer the only path forward. They were the Blackwater clan of Devil's Backbone Ridge, the Morrows of Whispering Pine Hollow, the Ashfords who settled along Serpent's Creek, the Grimm family of Bone Valley, and the Vances who made their home in the shadow of Widow's Peak. What united these families wasn't geography or blood relation, but something far more sinister. Each discovered that the mountains themselves were listening, waiting, hungry for those desperate enough to make a bargain with forces that predated European settlement by centuries. The Cherokee had known. Their oral histories spoke of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where ancient entities slumbered beneath the earth, occasionally stirring to offer gifts to those brave or foolish enough to accept them. The Blackwater clan was the first to cross that threshold. Samuel Blackwater, a failed preacher turned moonshiner, had lost everything to a series of federal raids that left his family destitute and his reputation in ruins. On the night of the winter solstice, as snow fell thick enough to muffle sound and obscure vision, Samuel ventured deep into the caves beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge. Local Cherokee elders had warned settlers about these particular caverns, speaking of them as doorways to the underworld, places where the spirits of the dead congregated to plot their return to the world of the living. Samuel carried with him a leather satchel containing his most precious possessions, his father's Bible, his grandfather's silver pocket watch, and a small vial of his own blood drawn with a consecrated blade. He had spent months researching forbidden texts, studying accounts of European witchcraft and African conjure work, piecing together fragments of knowledge that seemed to point toward a single terrible truth. Power could be purchased, but the price was always higher than it first appeared. The cave system beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge extended far deeper than any geological survey had ever documented. Samuel descended through chambers carved with symbols that predated any known Native American culture, past underground streams that flowed upward in defiance of gravity, beyond caverns where the temperature fluctuated wildly without any apparent source. At the deepest point accessible to human exploration, he found what he was seeking: a circular chamber with walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and in the center, a pool of liquid that was neither water nor oil, but something that moved with its own intelligence. The entity that responded to Samuel's desperate prayers spoke not in words but in images that burned themselves directly into his consciousness. It showed him visions of prosperity beyond imagination, of power that would make his family name feared and respected throughout the region, of secrets that would give him dominion over life and death itself. The price was simple: monthly offerings of blood, flesh, and spirit, not just from Samuel himself, but from his entire bloodline for 7 generations. Each child born into the Blackwater clan would be marked from birth, their souls partially claimed by the entity, their lives extended only as long they continued to feed the hunger that dwelt beneath the mountain. Samuel accepted without hesitation. Within a year, Blackwater moonshine had become the most sought-after whiskey in 3 states, not because of its quality, but because of the strange effects it produced in those who drank it. Customers reported visions of the future, temporary supernatural abilities, and an addictive euphoria that no other liquor could match. The family's wealth grew exponentially, but so did their reputation for darkness. Neighbors began to notice that the Blackwater children never seemed to age normally, that they possessed an uncanny ability to predict deaths and disasters, and that livestock and wild animals gave their property an unnaturally wide berth. The monthly rituals took place in the cave chamber, with the entire Blackwater family descending into the depths to maintain their infernal contract. Samuel's wife, Martha, initially resisted participating, but the entity's influence proved impossible to resist. One by one, family members would approach the central pool and allow their blood to mingle with the dark liquid, speaking words in a language that predated human speech, while the entity whispered instructions for the coming month. These instructions were always specific and always terrible: which neighbors to curse, which competitors to drive to madness, which children from other families to mark for future recruitment into their dark practices. The Blackwater family's prosperity continued for 3 generations, each more depraved than the last. Samuel's son, Jeremiah, expanded the family's operations beyond moonshining into areas that local law enforcement refused to investigate. They began offering services to other desperate families throughout the region: curses for enemies, love potions that enslaved the will, protective charms that required horrific sacrifices to maintain their power. The family compound grew into a complex of buildings connected by underground tunnels, with laboratories where they distilled not just alcohol, but concentrated essences of human emotion, fear, and despair. By the 1890s, the Blackwater clan had become the unofficial rulers of Devil's Backbone Ridge and the surrounding valleys. Their influence extended into county politics, with judges and sheriffs either bought or blackmailed into compliance. They operated their own courts, conducting trials for those who crossed them, dispensing justice that always ended in death or something worse. Their methods of execution were elaborate and ritualistic, designed not just to kill, but to harvest the spiritual energy released at the moment of death, which they would then offer to the entity beneath the mountain. The family's children were raised from birth to accept their role as servants of the darkness. They learned to read the ancient symbols carved into the cave walls, to interpret the visions that came to them in dreams, to manipulate the supernatural forces that flowed through their bloodline like poison. Many developed physical abnormalities that marked them as different from ordinary humans: eyes that reflected light like an animal's, skin that remained cold to the touch, regardless of temperature, voices that could compel obedience from those who heard them speak. The Blackwater clan's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely, if not for the arrival of a federal marshal named Thomas Hartwell in the spring of 1923. Hartwell had been investigating a series of disappearances throughout the region, following a trail of evidence that led directly to Devil's Backbone Ridge. Unlike previous investigators who had been bought off or frightened away, Hartwell possessed both the determination and the spiritual protection necessary to confront the Blackwater family directly. Hartwell had been raised by Cherokee grandparents who had taught him the old ways of combating supernatural evil. He carried with him sacred items blessed by tribal elders, weapons forged from iron taken from a church bell, and protective charms that had been passed down through generations of his family. When he finally confronted the Blackwater clan at their compound, he found them in the middle of conducting one of their monthly rituals, with several kidnapped victims chained around the central pool in the cave chamber. The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in official law enforcement records. Hartwell's report, buried deep in federal archives and classified for reasons that remain unclear, described supernatural phenomena that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. The Blackwater family members displayed abilities that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They moved with inhuman speed, shrugged off gunshot wounds that should have been fatal, and commanded forces that turned the very cave system into a weapon against their attacker. But Hartwell's spiritual protections proved stronger than the entity's influence. Using techniques taught to him by his Cherokee ancestors, he was able to disrupt the ritual and sever the connection between the Blackwater family and the entity beneath the mountain. The result was catastrophic for the clan. Without the supernatural power that had sustained them for generations, their bodies began to age rapidly, their minds fragmenting under the weight of decades of accumulated guilt and horror. The entity itself, deprived of its primary source of sustenance, retreated deeper into the earth, but not before issuing a final curse upon the region. It declared that the hunger it had cultivated in the Blackwater family would spread to others, that the darkness they had welcomed into the world would find new hosts, new families desperate enough to make similar bargains. The rituals they had perfected would be remembered and repeated. The knowledge they had accumulated would be passed on to those who sought power at any cost. Marshall Hartwell's investigation uncovered evidence of the Blackwater clan's activities spanning nearly 8 decades, detailed journals describing their rituals, maps showing the locations of mass graves throughout the region, correspondence with other families who had sought their services or attempted to emulate their practices. The scope of their crimes was so vast that federal authorities made the decision to classify the entire case, sealing the evidence and ensuring that the true extent of the Blackwater family's depravity would never become public knowledge. The cave system beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge was officially declared unstable and sealed with concrete, though local residents report that the barriers have been mysteriously breached on several occasions. The Blackwater compound was burned to the ground, but the underground tunnels remain, and urban explorers who venture into them often emerge with stories of strange sounds, unexplained temperature fluctuations, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The Blackwater bloodline did not end with the destruction of the original clan. Several family members had married into other families throughout the region, spreading their corrupted genetics and their knowledge of dark rituals to new generations. These descendants, many of whom were unaware of their heritage, began experiencing strange dreams and inexplicable urges as they reached maturity. Some sought out the abandoned Blackwater compound, drawn by instincts they couldn't understand, while others simply began developing their own variations of the family's practices. Modern investigators who have studied the Blackwater case theorize that the entity beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge was not destroyed but merely dormant, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to reestablish its connection to the world above. They point to recent incidents in the region, unexplained disappearances that follow the same patterns as those from the Blackwater era, reports of strange lights emanating from the sealed cave system, and the discovery of ritual sites that show clear evidence of recent use. The legacy of the Blackwater clan serves as a warning about the true cost of power obtained through supernatural means. Their story demonstrates that in the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grows thin, there are still entities waiting to exploit human desperation and greed. The mountains remember what was done in their shadows, and the darkness that once consumed the Blackwater family continues to hunger for new victims, new families willing to trade their souls for temporary prosperity and power. The winter of 1889 brought more than just the harshest cold in living memory to the remote hollows of Appalachia. It brought revelations that would forever change how we understand the depths of human darkness that can flourish in isolation. While Samuel Blackwater's pact beneath Devil's Backbone Ridge had established a template for supernatural malevolence, his success did not go unnoticed by other desperate families scattered throughout the mountain wilderness. Word travels strangely in the mountains, not through newspapers or telegraphs, but through whispered conversations at trading posts, through the knowing looks exchanged between those who had witnessed things that defied explanation. By the time the first snows began falling in November of 1889, 5 separate bloodlines had made their own pilgrimages to places where the boundary between worlds wore thin. Each family sought different forms of salvation from their crushing poverty and despair. Each would discover that salvation, when offered by ancient entities dwelling in the mountain's depths, comes with prices that compound across generations. The Ashford family of Ravens Hollow faced starvation as their third consecutive crop failure left them with nothing but withered corn and dying livestock. Margaret Ashford, pregnant with her 7th child and watching her youngest waste away from malnutrition, made the desperate decision to venture into the caverns beneath Widow's Peak on the night of the winter solstice. Note: local Cherokee legends spoke of these caves as gateways to the underworld, places where the spirits of the dead lingered and bargains could be struck with entities that predated human settlement. Margaret descended into the limestone depths, carrying only a torch and a small bag of her grandmother's silver jewelry, the last valuable possessions the family owned. The caverns extended far deeper than anyone had mapped, with passages that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Strange symbols covered the walls, not carved by human hands, but formed by mineral deposits that had arranged themselves into patterns that hurt to look at directly. In the deepest chamber, Margaret discovered what appeared to be a natural amphitheater where the rock walls curved upward into darkness. At the center lay a pool of water, so perfectly still it reflected light, like polished obsidian. The air here carried a metallic taste that made her teeth ache and her unborn child stir restlessly in her womb. When she called out desperately for help, for any force that might save her family from starvation, the water began to ripple despite the absence of any wind. A voice emerged from the depths, speaking not in words but in sensations that bypassed her ears and vibrated directly through her bones. The entity offered sustenance in exchange for service, prosperity in return for loyalty that would bind not just Margaret, but her bloodline for generations to come. The bargain required her to return monthly, bringing offerings of her own blood and that of her children, feeding the thing that dwelt beneath the water with the life force of her family. Margaret accepted without hesitation, slicing her palm with a piece of sharpened flint and allowing her blood to drip into the obsidian pool. The water hissed and steamed where each drop fell, and she felt something ancient and hungry stir in the depths below. By morning, the Ashford larder was mysteriously full of preserved meats, dried fruits, and grain that had not been there the night before. Their dying livestock recovered with supernatural speed, and their barren fields began producing crops even in the depths of winter. The prosperity came with immediate changes to the family itself. Margaret's remaining pregnancy progressed with unnatural speed, and she gave birth to twins whose eyes reflected light like those of nocturnal animals. The children born after her pact possessed an uncanny ability to find food in the wilderness, returning from foraging expeditions with game animals that should have been hibernating and edible plants that grew in locations where nothing should have survived the harsh mountain winters. As the years passed, the Ashford children developed increasingly unusual traits. They could navigate the mountain paths in complete darkness, their enhanced night vision allowing them to hunt and gather during the new moon when other families huddled in their cabins. More disturbing was their apparent immunity to hunger and cold, surviving on minimal food and wearing light clothing even during the harshest blizzards. Neighbors began to whisper about the Ashford children's strange diet, claiming they had been seen consuming raw meat and drinking from streams that other livestock avoided. The monthly pilgrimages to the caverns became family traditions, with each generation adding their own blood to the obsidian pool. The entity's demands grew more specific over time, requiring not just blood, but memories, dreams, and eventually pieces of the family's humanity itself. Children who participated in these rituals would return speaking in languages that predated European settlement, their personalities subtly altered as though something else had taken residence, alongside their original consciousness. By 1920, the Ashford family had become something barely recognizable as human. They avoided sunlight, conducted their business with neighbors only during overcast days or at dusk, and their voices carried harmonics that made listeners feel inexplicably uneasy. Their prosperity continued to grow, but so did their isolation from the human community they had once been part of. The family compound became a place other mountain folk avoided, though their enhanced crops and livestock were too valuable to boycott entirely. The entity's influence extended beyond the immediate family to affect the very landscape around their property. The caverns beneath Widow's Peak began to expand, new passages opening spontaneously during significant lunar events. Wildlife in the area exhibited unusual behaviors, with predators showing unnatural intelligence and prey animals displaying pack hunting techniques that defied their species' normal instincts. Most disturbing were the reports of hybrid creatures, animals that seemed to combine characteristics of multiple species in ways that suggested deliberate breeding programs rather than natural evolution. The Ashford bloodlines' connection to the entity manifested in their ability to communicate with and control the changed wildlife. Family members could summon specific animals with sounds that resembled no known language, and these creatures would perform tasks that required human-level intelligence. Neighbors reported seeing ravens delivering written messages between Ashford properties, while wolves and bears seemed to serve as sentries around the family's extended territory. During the Great Depression, when other mountain families faced renewed hardship, the Ashfords emerged as mysterious benefactors, providing food and supplies to desperate neighbors in exchange for small favors. These favors initially seemed innocuous, requests for minor personal items like locks of hair, worn clothing, or family photographs. Recipients soon discovered that their benefactors had gained an unsettling level of insight into their private lives, knowing details about family secrets, personal fears, and hidden desires that should have been impossible to discover. The Ashford family's influence grew through a network of obligation and debt that ensnared entire communities. Those who accepted their help found themselves unable to refuse increasingly strange requests, as though the initial transaction had created a spiritual bond that compelled continued cooperation. Families who tried to break free from these arrangements often experienced sudden misfortunes, crop failures, livestock deaths, or mysterious illnesses that struck with surgical precision. The entity's hunger evolved beyond simple blood offerings to encompass more complex forms of spiritual nourishment. The Ashfords began hosting gatherings during significant astronomical events, inviting their network of obligated neighbors to participate in ceremonies that combined elements of mountain folk traditions with practices that seemed to originate from much older sources. These gatherings took place in natural amphitheaters deep in the mountains, locations that had been modified with carefully arranged stones and carved symbols that created acoustic effects, allowing whispered words to carry impossible distances. Participants in these ceremonies reported shared experiences that lingered long after the events concluded, vivid dreams featuring the same symbolic imagery, temporary abilities to understand the speech of animals, and occasional precognitive flashes that allowed them to anticipate natural disasters or human conflicts. While these experiences were often beneficial in practical terms, they also created a psychological dependency that made breaking free from the Ashford influence increasingly difficult. The family's true nature became apparent during the harsh winter of 1943, when a blizzard trapped a group of government surveyors in the mountains near their territory. The men took shelter in what appeared to be an abandoned cabin, only to discover they were being observed by figures that moved through the snow with impossible grace. When rescue teams finally reached the location weeks later, they found the cabin empty except for detailed journals describing encounters with beings that appeared human but possessed abilities that defied explanation. The surveyors wrote of hosts who provided warmth and sustenance without any visible fire or food stores, who spoke in voices that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and who demonstrated knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away in real time. Most disturbing were the descriptions of children who who appeared to be aging and growing younger in cycles, as though their physical forms were fluid rather than fixed. These accounts, classified by military authorities but leaked decades later, provided the first official documentation of the Ashford family's supernatural nature. The reports described a community that had transcended human limitations but retained enough humanity to interact with the outside world when necessary. Their mountain territory had become a pocket dimension where natural laws operated according to different principles, sustained by the ongoing relationship between the family and the entity dwelling in the caverns beneath Widow's Peak. The Ashford influence reached its peak during the 1950s when their network of obligated families extended across 3 states. Their ability to predict and manipulate natural events made them invaluable to mining companies, logging operations, and agricultural enterprises that paid handsomely for their services. The family had effectively become a supernatural consulting firm, providing solutions to problems that conventional means couldn't address. However, this expansion also attracted unwanted attention from federal authorities who had been monitoring unusual phenomena in the Appalachian region since the Blackwater incident. A joint task force involving agents from multiple agencies began investigating the Ashford operations in 1962 using techniques developed during the earlier supernatural encounters. The investigation revealed a network of influence that extended far beyond simple mountain folk magic, involving entities and practices that posed potential threats to national security. The final confrontation occurred during the winter solstice of 1967, when federal agents attempted to seal the caverns beneath Widow's Peak using military-grade explosives combined with protective symbols derived from Cherokee spiritual traditions. The Ashford family, apparently forewarned by their supernatural patron, had already begun their exodus to deeper mountain territories. However, the sealing operation succeeded in severing the primary connection between the entity and the physical world, causing the family's supernatural abilities to diminish significantly. In the aftermath, the Ashford territory returned to a more natural state, though certain locations remained permanently altered. The caverns beneath Widow's Peak were successfully sealed, but smaller openings continued to appear sporadically during significant lunar events. The family itself scattered to remote locations throughout the Appalachian chain, their supernatural abilities weakened but not entirely eliminated. Contemporary reports suggest that Ashford descendants continue to practice modified versions of their ancestral traditions, though without the direct connection to the entity that once sustained their supernatural abilities. These modern practitioners focus on more subtle forms of influence, using their inherited sensitivity to natural cycles and enhanced intuition to maintain modest prosperity in an increasingly complex world. The Ashford legacy serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of supernatural bargains. While their initial pact provided immediate relief from desperate circumstances, the spiritual cost compounded across generations until the family had sacrificed their essential humanity for continued prosperity. Their story demonstrates how easily survival instincts can lead to choices that transform not just individuals, but entire bloodlines into something fundamentally different from their original nature. The sealed caverns beneath Widow's Peak remain under federal monitoring, though the official records classify the site as a geological hazard rather than acknowledging its supernatural significance. Local residents continue to report unusual phenomena in the area, particularly during winter months when the boundary between worlds traditionally grows thin. Those reports suggest that while the primary entity may have been contained, its influence on the local environment persists in subtle ways. The Ashford family's transformation from desperate mountain farmers to supernatural entities illustrates the seductive nature of power that comes from sources beyond human understanding. Their story warns of how quickly desperation can lead to bargains that seem beneficial in the short term, but carry consequences that extend far beyond the original participants. The mountains remember their choices, and the echoes of their pact continue to influence the region's spiritual landscape decades after the family's departure. Modern researchers studying Appalachian folklore often encounter references to the Ashford legacy, though the family's true nature remains hidden beneath layers of local legend and deliberate misinformation. Their story serves as a reminder that in the remote mountain regions where human civilization meets ancient forces, the line between survival and damnation can be thinner than the morning mist that clings to the hollow ridges at dawn. But what most people don't realize is that these 5 families were just the beginning. Their success, their power, their unnatural abilities, all of it drew attention from others who had heard whispers in the darkness. By the 1890s, word had spread through the hidden networks of desperate souls who lived in the mountain's shadow. Stories traveled along logging roads and mining camps, carried by men who had seen too much and drunk too much trying to forget it. The bargains these families had struck created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate territories. The entities they had awakened, the ancient things dwelling in the mountain's depths, grew stronger with each offering. Each drop of blood spilled, each memory surrendered, each piece of humanity traded away, fed something vast and patient that had been waiting beneath the stone for generations beyond counting. What happened next would transform the entire region into something unrecognizable. Between 1890 and 1920, a period locals still refer to as the Hungry Years, 17 additional families would venture into those same caverns. 17 more bloodlines would kneel before altars of living stone and whisper their desperate pleas into the listening darkness. The Henderson family arrived from Georgia in 1892, fleeing debt collectors and carrying nothing but their 3 young children and a determination to survive. William Henderson had heard rumors in taverns about the prosperity of certain mountain families, about coal that burned with unusual heat and timber that never rotted. When the first winter nearly claimed his youngest daughter to pneumonia, he followed the old trails deeper into the mountains than any map showed. The cavern he found was different from those discovered by earlier families. This one descended through a series of natural chambers, each one colder than the last, until he reached a vast underground lake where the water moved without wind and reflected no light. At the lake's center stood a small island connected to the shore by a narrow stone bridge that appeared to be carved from a single piece of black granite. On that island, Henderson found what he would later describe in his journal as a congregation of shadows. Dozens of forms that might once have been human stood in perfect silence around a circular depression in the stone. As he approached, these figures turned toward him in unison, their movements creating no sound, their faces hidden beneath hoods that seemed to absorb the light from his lantern. "I need help," Henderson whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "My family is dying." The response came not as words, but as images that flooded his mind. He saw his daughter healthy and strong, his family prosperous, his name spoken with respect throughout the mountain communities. But he also saw the price. The shadows wanted something specific from the Henderson line, something that would be collected from each generation in turn. By 1895, the Henderson family had become the most successful traders in the region. Their pack trains carried goods through mountain passes that other merchants claimed were impassable. Their horses never tired, their supplies never spoiled, and their knowledge of safe routes through treacherous terrain was legendary. But every third year, on the anniversary of William's first visit to the underground lake, one member of the Henderson family would disappear for exactly 13 days. When they returned, they carried with them detailed maps of places no living person had ever seen, along with small objects that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. Family members who underwent these disappearances aged rapidly afterward, their hair turning white within months, their eyes taking on a distant quality, as though they were perpetually looking at something just beyond the visible world. The Crane family followed a different path to the same destination. Ezra Crane was a circuit preacher who had lost his faith after watching his congregation die of cholera in 1894. His wife had perished, along with their twin sons, leaving him alone with questions that traditional religion couldn't answer. He had heard stories of mountain families who possessed unusual abilities, and in his grief-stricken desperation, he began seeking them out. What Crane discovered was that several of these families shared certain characteristics. They aged more slowly than their neighbors. They possessed an uncanny ability to predict weather and natural disasters, and they seemed to communicate with each other across vast distances without any visible means of doing so. Most intriguingly, they all spoke of dreams that came on specific nights, dreams that provided guidance and warnings about future events. Crane's theological training made him uniquely qualified to recognize what he was witnessing. These families had entered into covenant relationships with entities that existed outside normal human understanding. The dreams, the abilities, the unnatural longevity, all of it pointed to a systematic exchange of human limitations for supernatural capabilities. On the winter solstice of 1896, Crane descended into a cavern system that had been described to him by a member of the Morrow family. The chamber he found contained what appeared to be a primitive church, complete with stone pews arranged in perfect rows, facing a raised platform where something that might have been an altar stood draped in shadows that moved independently of any light source. As Crane approached the altar, he felt the presence of something vast and ancient focusing its attention on him. The entity that responded to his prayers was different from those that had answered the other families. This one spoke in theological terms, offering not just power, but a twisted form of divine revelation. "You seek to understand the nature of suffering," came a voice that seemed to speak from within the stone itself. "You want to know why the innocent perish while the wicked prosper. I can provide those answers, but understanding comes with obligations." The covenant Crane accepted that night transformed him into something between a prophet and a conduit. He gained the ability to heal certain ailments, to predict disasters, and to provide comfort to the dying through means that defied medical explanation. But he also became a gatherer of information for the entities beneath the mountain, traveling throughout the region and documenting the spiritual conditions of isolated communities. The Crane family's influence spread quietly through the establishment of small mountain churches where Ezra preached a modified form of Christianity that incorporated elements of much older traditions. His sermons spoke of ancient covenants, of bargains made in darkness, and of the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good. Those who attended these services often reported vivid dreams afterward, dreams that led them to make their own journeys into the mountain's depths. By 1900, the network of families bound to the mountain entities had grown to include bloodlines scattered across 5 states. They maintained contact through coded messages hidden in legitimate business correspondence, through gatherings disguised as religious revivals, and through the shared dreams that connected them all to the vast intelligence dwelling beneath the stone. The Whitmore family specialized in what they called the listening trade. Margaret Whitmore discovered her gift by accident in 1898 when she realized she could hear conversations taking place miles away simply by pressing her ear to certain stone formations. The ability had manifested after she had spent a night in a cave system fleeing from a violent thunderstorm, a night during which she had made desperate promises to whatever might be listening in the darkness. The entities that answered Margaret's pleas were different from those that had claimed other families. These seemed to be connected to the mountain's ability to conduct sound and vibration across vast distances. They granted her family the ability to eavesdrop on conversations, to detect the approach of strangers, and to communicate with each other across the network of connected caves that honeycomb the region. The Whitmores became the information brokers for the growing network of connected families. They knew when federal agents were planning investigations, when rival families were forming alliances, and when opportunities for expansion presented themselves. Their knowledge made them valuable allies and dangerous enemies, but it also marked them with physical changes that grew more pronounced with each generation. Whitmore children were born with unusual ear structures that allowed them to detect sounds at frequencies normal humans couldn't perceive. They developed an instinctive understanding of the mountain's acoustic properties, able to navigate cave systems in complete darkness by listening to the subtle echoes of their own breathing. Most disturbing was their tendency to have conversations with empty air, responding to voices that others couldn't hear. The Patterson family's entry into the network came through their involvement in the region's growing timber industry. James Patterson had acquired logging rights to several thousand acres of old-growth forest, but the trees proved impossible to harvest using conventional methods. The forest seemed to actively resist their efforts, with equipment breaking down mysteriously, workers becoming lost in areas they knew well, and cut trees somehow regrowing overnight. Local workers whispered that the forest was protected by something ancient, something that had been there since before the Cherokee had claimed the land. They spoke of trees that bled when cut, of shadows that moved against the light, and of voices that called from deep within the woods on moonless nights. In desperation, Patterson followed the advice of a worker who suggested he seek guidance from the mountain families who seemed to prosper despite the region's challenges. The path he was directed to follow led him to a grove where the trees grew in spirals, their trunks twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. At the center of this grove stood a single massive oak whose roots had grown above ground, forming a natural chamber beneath the tree. Inside this chamber, Patterson found what appeared to be a council of the forest itself. Ancient trees that had somehow gained consciousness spoke to him in voices like wind through leaves, offering him the ability to harvest their wood in exchange for his family's service as guardians of the deeper woodland. The covenant Patterson accepted made his family the intermediaries between the human world and the forest entities. They gained the ability to communicate with trees, to understand the forest's needs and desires, and to harvest timber in ways that actually strengthened the woodland rather than depleting it. But they also became bound to protect the forest's secrets, serving as guardians of groves where stranger things than twisted trees took root. Patterson lumber became legendary for its quality and durability. Buildings constructed with their wood never rotted, never burned, and seemed to actively resist damage from weather or pests. But workers who spent too much time around freshly cut Patterson timber reported hearing whispers from the wood itself, and several construction projects had to be abandoned when workers refused to continue due to the unsettling sounds coming from the building materials. The growing network of connected families created a shadow economy that operated alongside the region's legitimate businesses. They shared information, resources, and protection, but they also competed for the favor of the entities that had granted them their abilities. This competition sometimes erupted into conflicts that devastated entire communities, leaving behind unexplained disappearances and areas where the very landscape seemed scarred by supernatural violence. The winter of 1903 brought what local historians carefully recorded as the Great Silence, a period of 3 months when no sounds of any kind were heard in a 50-square-mile area of the mountains. Birds stopped singing, streams stopped flowing audibly, and even the wind made no noise as it moved through the trees. Residents reported being able to speak and hear each other, but any sounds they made seemed to be absorbed by the air itself within moments. The cause of the Great Silence was later traced to a territorial dispute between 3 of the connected families, each of whom had called upon their patron entities for support in claiming the same valuable tract of land. The entity's response was to temporarily isolate the entire region from the normal flow of sound and vibration, creating a zone of absolute acoustic death that served as a warning to all the families about the consequences of allowing their conflicts to escalate. When the silence finally ended, it was replaced by 3 days of constant, low-frequency humming that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The sound was felt more than heard, vibrating through the bones of every living creature in the region and leaving a permanent mark on those who experienced it. Many reported that they could still hear the humming years later, especially during times of stress or when they ventured too close to certain cave systems. The entities beneath the mountain had demonstrated their power and their displeasure, but they had also revealed the extent of their influence. The network of families they had claimed now numbered in the hundreds, spread across multiple states, connected by bonds that transcended normal human understanding. What had begun as individual bargains, struck in desperation, had evolved into something far more complex and far more dangerous. The mountain had become a living entity in its own right, its consciousness distributed through the network of families who served as its eyes and ears in the human world. Every decision they made, every child they raised, every business they conducted was influenced by the ancient intelligence that had claimed them. They were no longer entirely human, but they were not yet something else entirely. They existed in a liminal space between two worlds, carrying out purposes they only partially understood, serving needs they couldn't fully comprehend. The mountain's hunger had grown with each family that joined the network, and that hunger was beginning to extend beyond the remote hollows where it had first awakened. The entities beneath the stone were preparing for something larger, something that would require the cooperation of all the families they had claimed. The individual bargains struck in desperation were revealed to be pieces of a much larger pattern, components of a design that had been unfolding for generations. The mountain had been patient, but its patience was not infinite. The age of individual survival was ending. The age of collective transformation was about to begin. The collective consciousness had grown hungry by the winter of 1947, and the mountains themselves began to dream in languages older than Cherokee or Shawnee. What had started as individual family bargains decades earlier was evolving into something far more dangerous. The entities beneath the peaks had tasted enough blood, absorbed enough dreams, and witnessed enough human desperation to understand that their scattered agreements could be woven into something magnificent and terrible. The first sign came during the Great Convergence of 1948, when representatives from all the bonded families began experiencing the same vision simultaneously. They saw themselves standing in a vast underground cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows that moved with purpose. The walls pulsed with veins of that strange luminescence they'd grown to recognize, and in the center stood something that defied description. Not the shadowy figures they'd bargained with individually, but a synthesis of all their patrons combined into a presence that radiated authority beyond comprehension. In these shared dreams, the entity spoke with voices that harmonized like a choir of the damned. The time of individual contracts draws to a close, it declared. You have proven yourselves worthy vessels. Now we require something greater than blood or dreams. We require unity. The families understood their separate bargains had been tests, auditions for a grander performance. The entities had been patient, cultivating their human partners, like gardeners tending particularly valuable crops. But now the harvest season approached, and what would be reaped was not grain or fruit, but the very essence of human autonomy in the Appalachian region. Margaret Ashford, now in her 70s and bearing the accumulated physical cost of decades of supernatural enhancement, was the first to comprehend the scope of what was being proposed. Her family's gift for sensing emotional currents had evolved into something approaching telepathy, and through this heightened perception, she could feel the intentions of the mountain entities like a cold wind through her bones. They gathered at the Thornton mine on the winter solstice of 1948, not by choice, but by compulsion. Every family that had made bargains found themselves drawn to the deepest accessible shaft, carrying offerings they hadn't consciously prepared. The Blackwaters brought vials of what appeared to be liquid shadow. The Howards carried bundles of herbs that seemed to writhe in their hands. The Ashfords brought mirrors that reflected scenes from decades past instead of present images. The ceremony that followed lasted 3 days and nights, during which time the surrounding counties experienced what meteorologists called an unprecedented weather anomaly. Temperatures plummeted to record lows, snow fell in patterns that formed geometric designs when viewed from above, and the aurora borealis appeared as far south as Tennessee, painting the sky in colors that hurt to look at directly. Inside the mine, the families underwent a transformation that made their previous changes seem trivial. The ritual required each bloodline to contribute what they valued most. The Blackwaters surrendered their ability to feel fear, which had been their last connection to ordinary human emotion. The Howards gave up their capacity for individual thought, becoming a collective consciousness that spoke in unison. The Ashfords sacrificed their physical forms entirely, becoming incorporeal entities that could inhabit the bodies of others at will. But the most profound change occurred in the relationship between the families and the mountain entities. The distinction between patron and client dissolved. The families became extensions of the ancient consciousnesses, while the entities gained the ability to interact with the physical world through their human vessels. It was a merger that created something unprecedented in the folklore of any culture, a supernatural collective that retained human intelligence and ambition while wielding powers that transcended natural law. The immediate effects were subtle but far-reaching. Political elections in the region began producing results that seemed to favor policies beneficial to mining, logging, and other extractive industries, regardless of the stated platforms of the candidates. Economic development that should have brought prosperity to struggling communities instead seemed to funnel wealth toward projects that served no clear purpose. Infrastructure improvements created roads and rail lines that led to locations that officially didn't exist on any map. More disturbing were the changes in the general population. Families who had lived in the region for generations began experiencing a collective amnesia about local history. Stories that had been passed down for centuries simply vanished from memory. Church records dating back to the 1800s were found to have pages missing, always the same pages, as if removed by someone with access to every religious institution in the area. The phenomenon spread through a process that resembled viral infection more than supernatural influence. Individuals who spent extended periods in the region would gradually lose their ability to form memories of events that contradicted the new narrative being woven by the collective. They would forget conversations about strange lights in the mountains, dismiss their own experiences with unexplained phenomena, and find themselves unable to maintain interest in investigating the increasing number of anomalies. Children born after 1948 exhibited the strongest connection to the collective consciousness. They demonstrated uncanny knowledge of local geography, including areas that were supposedly inaccessible. They could predict weather patterns with accuracy that surpassed meteorological instruments. Most unsettling, they showed no curiosity about the world beyond the mountains, as if the very concept of elsewhere held no meaning for them. The collective's influence extended beyond human manipulation. The natural world itself began responding to their will. Forest fires would start and stop according to patterns that served the group's purposes, clearing land for development or creating barriers to outside investigation. Wildlife behavior changed dramatically, with normally territorial species cooperating in ways that suggested coordination by an external intelligence. Underground, the network of tunnels and chambers that had served individual families expanded into a vast subterranean complex. These passages connected sites hundreds of miles apart, creating a transportation system that allowed the collective to move resources and personnel without using conventional infrastructure. The walls of these tunnels were lined with that strange luminescent material, creating a network of light that pulsed in rhythm with the collective's activities. By 1952, the transformation was complete. The mountains had become a single organism with human consciousness distributed throughout its structure. The original families still existed as distinct entities, but they functioned as specialized organs within a larger body. The Blackwaters served as the collective's sensory system, monitoring threats and opportunities across the region. The Howards became its memory, maintaining the accumulated knowledge and experience of all their interactions. The Ashfords functioned as its immune system, neutralizing individuals or groups that posed risks to the collective's goals. The true scope of their power became apparent during the federal investigation of 1953, when a team of government agents arrived to investigate reports of unusual activity in the region. The team consisted of 12 experienced investigators equipped with the most advanced technology available at the time. They established a base of operations in what they believed was a secure location and began systematic documentation of anomalies. Within 72 hours, the entire team had vanished. Their equipment was found neatly arranged in their abandoned campsite, but all recordings had been erased and replaced with the hours of footage showing empty landscapes. The only trace of the investigators was a series of photographs that appeared to show them walking willingly into the forest, their expressions peaceful and their posture relaxed, as if they were simply taking a pleasant stroll. The investigation was quietly closed, and the official report classified the incident as a case of equipment failure and personnel reassignment. But internal government documents, released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed a different story. The investigators had sent increasingly disturbing reports during their brief time in the region, describing encounters with individuals who seemed to know their thoughts before they spoke them, technology that malfunctioned in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage, and a growing sense that they were being observed by something vast and patient. The final transmission from the team leader, recorded just hours before their disappearance, consisted of a single sentence repeated multiple times. "We understand now. We want to stay." This pattern of absorption, rather than elimination, became the collective's preferred method of dealing with potential threats. Rather than creating martyrs or generating investigations, they would simply convert opposition into cooperation. Journalists who arrived to investigate stories about the region would file reports that praised the area's natural beauty and economic potential. Scientists who came to study geological anomalies would publish papers that found nothing unusual about the local formations. The process was so effective that by 1955, the collective had achieved something unprecedented: invisibility through integration. They had become so thoroughly embedded in the region's social economic, and political structures that they were indistinguishable from legitimate authority. Local governments, businesses, and institutions all functioned according to their influence, but in ways that appeared entirely normal to outside observers. The collective's long-term goals remained mysterious even to those who had become part of it. Individual members retained enough of their original personalities to experience curiosity about the ultimate purpose of their transformation, but attempts to probe too deeply into the entity's intentions resulted in a kind of mental static that made sustained inquiry impossible. What was clear was that the collective was preparing for something. The infrastructure they built, the resources they accumulated, and the people they influenced all seemed to serve a purpose that extended far beyond mere regional control. The tunnels they carved went deeper than any practical mining operation required. The technologies they developed exceeded what should have been possible with available materials and knowledge. The loyalty they commanded was absolute in ways that suggested preparation for challenges that would test every aspect of their capabilities. The mountains themselves had become a fortress, but whether it was designed to keep something out or to keep something in remained an open question. The collective's activities suggested both possibilities. They were creating defenses against external threats while simultaneously building containment systems for something that already existed within their territory. As the 1950s progressed, the collective's influence began to extend beyond the Appalachian region. Individuals who had been exposed to their influence and then relocated to other areas carried something with them, a subtle change in their neural patterns that made them responsive to signals from the mountains. These human vectors didn't actively serve the collective's interests, but they provided a network of passive sensors that allowed the mountain consciousness to monitor developments across the continent. The true test of the collective's power came during the construction of the interstate highway system in the 1960s. Federal planners initially proposed routes that would have cut directly through the heart of the collective's territory, bringing unprecedented outside attention and disrupting the delicate balance they had established. The proposed highways would have connected isolated communities to the broader national infrastructure, making it impossible to maintain the region's carefully cultivated obscurity. The collective's response demonstrated the full scope of their capabilities. Rather than opposing the highway construction through obvious political or legal channels, they influenced the process through a network of subtle interventions. Survey teams found that their initial measurements were consistently inaccurate when they entered certain areas, forcing them to recommend alternative routes. Construction equipment experienced mysterious failures that made work in specific locations prohibitively expensive. Environmental studies revealed previously unknown species of plants and animals that required protection under federal law. Most remarkably, the collective managed to alter the economic calculations that justified the highway routes. Communities that had appeared to be growing and prosperous during initial surveys suddenly showed signs of economic decline that made highway access seem less valuable. Meanwhile, alternative routes through areas that had previously seemed economically marginal began to appear more attractive as new businesses and development opportunities emerged along those paths. The result was a transportation network that flowed around the collective's territory like water around a stone. The highways brought progress and connectivity to the broader Appalachian region while leaving the collective's core areas untouched. To outside observers, this appeared to be the natural result of geographical and economic factors. Only those with access to the complete planning documents could see the pattern of influences that had shaped the final outcome. This success marked the collective's emergence as a force capable of influencing national policy while remaining completely invisible to those they manipulated. They had achieved a level of integration with existing power structures that made them effectively immune to conventional forms of investigation or opposition. They were not outside the system. They had become part of the system's operating principles. The collective's influence continued to grow throughout the following decades, but always in ways that appeared natural and inevitable. They had learned to work with the grain of human nature rather than against it, achieving their goals by making their preferred outcomes seem like the obvious choices for everyone involved. They had become the perfect parasites, so well adapted to their hosts that the relationship appeared to be purely symbiotic. As the 20th century drew to a close, the collective's preparations entered a new phase. The infrastructure they had built over decades was finally approaching completion. The network of human agents they had cultivated was reaching critical mass. The supernatural capabilities they had developed were approaching levels that would allow them to influence events on a global scale, but the mountains themselves were changing in ways that suggested the collective's transformation was far from complete. The entities that had initiated the original bargains were revealing themselves to be something far more complex and ambitious than anyone had imagined. The collective consciousness that had emerged from the merger of human and supernatural elements was itself evolving, developing capabilities and purposes that transcended the sum of its parts. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in human history, the emergence of a new form of consciousness that combined human intelligence with supernatural power and the patient wisdom of geological time. The mountains were awakening, and their dreams were beginning to reshape reality itself. By the winter of 1902, something fundamental had shifted in the collective consciousness of these 5 families. What had begun as separate, desperate bargains was evolving into something far more interconnected and dangerous. The Holloway children, with their silvery skin and nocturnal vision, began appearing in the dreams of Carver descendants. The Lael healers found themselves inexplicably drawn to Thornton mining accidents, arriving before anyone had sent word. The Whitaker musicians discovered that their compositions contained melodies they had never written, harmonies that seemed to flow from some shared wellspring of knowledge. The first documented gathering of all 5 families occurred during the winter solstice of 1903 in a natural amphitheater deep within the Cumberland Mountains that locals called the Listening Bowl. No historical record explains how they knew to convene there, but witnesses from neighboring settlements reported seeing lantern lights moving through the forest for 3 nights, all converging on that remote location. What transpired during those 3 days would bind these families together in ways that transcended blood or marriage. Sarah Holloway, Samuel's daughter, later wrote in her private journal about the event. Her account, discovered in 1987 during the demolition of the family's abandoned homestead, provides the only first-hand description of what she called the Great Joining. According to Sarah, Each family brought something to the gathering. The Holloways carried coal that glowed with inner fire. The Carvers brought wood that bled crimson sap. The Lells offered vials of tears collected from patients whose pain they had absorbed. The Thorntons presented black stones that hummed with underground rhythms. The Whitakers arrived with instruments that played themselves when touched by moonlight. At the center of the natural amphitheater, the families constructed an altar from materials each had contributed. The coal formed the base, the bleeding wood created geometric patterns, the tears were poured into channels carved in the stone, and the humming rocks were arranged in precise mathematical sequences. The self-playing instruments provided what Sarah described as a soundtrack that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than the instruments. The ritual that followed defied conventional understanding. Rather than worship or supplication, it appeared to be a form of negotiation. Each family spokesperson stepped forward and spoke not in English, but in languages that seemed to emerge from their throats without conscious knowledge. Sarah noted that she understood every word, despite never having heard these tongues before. The families were not just making offerings to the entities they had previously bargained with individually. They were facilitating a meeting between those entities, creating a supernatural consortium that would pool their collective influence. As the ceremony reached its crescendo, the very landscape began to respond. Trees swayed without wind, rocks shifted position, and the temperature fluctuated wildly. Most disturbing of all, the families began to physically change during the ritual. Sarah described watching her own hands elongate, her fingernails sharpening into claws, while her vision expanded to encompass spectrums of light that had never existed before. Similar transformations occurred across all 5 families, though each reflected the nature of their individual bargains. The Holloway transformations enhanced their underground abilities. Their eyes adapted to see in absolute darkness. Their hearing became sensitive enough to detect cave-ins days before they occurred, and their hands developed an ability to sense precious metals through solid rock. The Carvers experienced changes that connected them more deeply to forest ecosystems. They could identify the health of trees by touch, predict weather patterns by observing leaf movements, and navigate through any forest regardless of visibility conditions. The Lel metamorphosis was perhaps the most dramatic. Their capacity to absorb illness expanded beyond individual patients to encompass entire communities. They could sense disease outbreaks before symptoms appeared, identify the emotional and spiritual roots of physical ailments, and in extreme cases, transfer their own life force to heal otherwise fatal conditions. The Thorntons developed what could only be described as geological intuition. They could predict earthquakes, locate underground water sources, and identify the most profitable mining sites with supernatural accuracy. The Whitaker transformation was the most ethereal. Their musical abilities expanded beyond human composition to encompass sounds that existed in dimensions adjacent to our reality. They could compose music that induced specific emotional states, create melodies that healed psychological trauma, and in rare instances, produce harmonies that temporarily opened doorways to other realms of existence. But these enhanced abilities came with a terrible price. The families discovered that their individual bargains had been consolidated into a single, much larger obligation. They were no longer servants to separate entities, but components of a vast supernatural organism that spanned the entire Appalachian region. Their enhanced abilities were not gifts, but tools, and they were expected to use them in service of a plan that none of them fully understood. The first manifestation of this larger plan became apparent in the years following the Great Joining. The families began receiving what they described as assignments, delivered through dreams, visions, or sometimes direct telepathic communication. These tasks seemed random at first. The Holloways were instructed to dig specific tunnels that connected to natural cave systems. The Carvers were directed to harvest particular trees and arrange the timber in geometric patterns across mountainsides. The Lels were commanded to treat certain patients while refusing others, creating patterns of health and illness that served some unknown purpose. The Thorntons received instructions to extract specific minerals from precise locations, often materials that had no apparent commercial value. The Whitakers were compelled to perform concerts at particular times and locations, their music creating vibrations that seemed to resonate with underground geological formations. Initially, the families attempted to resist these compulsions, but they discovered that disobedience resulted in increasingly severe consequences. When Thomas Carver attempted to ignore an instruction to clear-cut a specific grove, his entire family was struck by a wasting illness that lasted until he completed the assigned task. When Margaret Lell refused to treat a patient she believed was beyond help, her healing abilities vanished entirely for 3 months, returning only when she performed the requested treatment. The families learned that their supernatural bargains had evolved into something resembling slavery, though the purpose of their labor remained mysterious. As the 20th century progressed, the pattern of assignments began to reveal a larger design. The tunnels dug by the Holloways connected to form a vast underground network that spanned multiple states. The geometric timber arrangements created by the Carvers, when viewed from aerial perspectives, formed symbols and patterns that corresponded to astronomical events. The selective healing and harming performed by the Lels created demographic changes that influenced local politics and economics in subtle but significant ways. The Thornton mining operations, guided by supernatural instruction, gradually extracted materials that were later revealed to be components of a massive underground construction project. The Whitaker musical performances, when mapped over time, created a grid of sonic vibrations that seemed to be preparing the mountain geology for some unprecedented event. By 1920, local observers began to notice that the natural laws governing the Appalachian region were slowly changing. Weather patterns became more extreme, but also more predictable, following rhythms that corresponded to the family's activities. Wildlife behavior shifted as animals began moving in patterns that mirrored the geometric arrangements created by the Carvers. Most disturbing of all, the boundary between the living and the dead began to blur in areas where the families had concentrated their efforts. Locals reported encounters with deceased relatives who delivered messages or warnings about future events. The families themselves began to experience changes that went beyond their initial transformations. Marriages between the different clans produced children with abilities that combined and amplified their parents' supernatural gifts. These hybrid descendants could not only perform their inherited functions, but also coordinate between different aspects of the larger plan. They served as living communication networks, able to relay information instantaneously across vast distances and between different supernatural entities. By 1930, the five families had effectively become a single extended organism with multiple specialized functions. The Holloway branches managed underground operations and mineral extraction. The Carver descendants controlled forestry and surface land use. The Lael lineages handled population health and demographic manipulation. The Thornton branches oversaw geological engineering and energy extraction. The Whitaker family provided communication and coordination through their expanded musical abilities. The Great Depression, rather than harming these families, provided them with unprecedented opportunities to expand their influence. As traditional economic systems collapsed, the supernatural prosperity of the five clans attracted desperate individuals who were willing to accept employment under any conditions. The families recruited workers who gradually became incorporated into their larger supernatural network, not through formal bargains, but through prolonged exposure to the transformed environment. These new recruits began exhibiting minor versions of the family's abilities. Mine workers developed enhanced night vision and underground navigation skills. Loggers gained intuitive understanding of forest ecosystems and weather patterns. Patients treated by Lel healers often retained permanent improvements in their health and longevity. Employees of Thornton mining operations showed unusual resistance to industrial accidents and occupational diseases. Those who attended Whitaker performances reported enhanced creativity and emotional stability that lasted for months afterward. What had begun as 5 separate family curses was evolving into a regional transformation that affected thousands of people across multiple states. The supernatural entities that had originally made individual bargains with desperate family members had used those initial contracts to establish a foothold in the physical world. Through the Great Joining and subsequent decades of coordinated activity, they had gradually expanded their influence to encompass entire ecosystems and human populations. The families began to understand that they were not servants of these entities, but rather components of their physical manifestation. The supernatural beings were not separate from the Appalachian region, but were in the process of becoming the region itself. Every tunnel dug, every tree harvested, every patient healed, every mineral extracted, and every song performed was contributing to the gradual transformation of the mountains into a conscious, intelligent organism with its own agenda and capabilities. This realization brought both terror and a strange form of liberation. The families no longer struggled against their supernatural obligations because they began to understand that resistance was not just futile, but meaningless. They were no longer human beings who had made bargains with supernatural entities. They had become the nervous system of something vast and ancient that was slowly awakening within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The question was no longer how to escape their bargains, but what this awakening consciousness intended to do with its newfound power. The entity that had emerged from the fusion of the 5 families was no longer content with regional dominance. By the late 1950s, something far more ambitious had taken root in the Appalachian depths. The collective consciousness that had once been separate bloodlines now operated as a single, vast intelligence with appetites that stretched beyond the mountain barriers that had contained it for generations. The first signs of this evolution appeared in seemingly unrelated incidents across multiple states. In Tennessee, entire mining operations would shut down overnight, their workers reporting shared nightmares of descending into tunnels that led not to coal seams but to chambers filled with whispering voices. In Kentucky, timber companies discovered that their equipment would mysteriously relocate itself, forming geometric patterns visible only from aircraft. Most disturbing of all were the reports from Virginia, where small towns began experiencing what locals called the forgetting. Residents would wake to find that certain buildings, certain people, certain memories had simply vanished as though they had never existed. The entity's influence had transcended the physical realm entirely. What had begun as blood pacts and ritual offerings had evolved into something that operated on the level of collective human consciousness itself. The mountain region was becoming a testing ground for reality manipulation on a scale that defied comprehension. Weather patterns shifted according to the entity's needs. Rivers changed course overnight. Mountain peaks appeared and disappeared from topographical surveys with no geological explanation. Government agencies that had once monitored the family's activities now found themselves unable to maintain coherent records. Files would alter themselves between readings. Photographs would show different locations despite being taken from identical positions. Investigators dispatched to the region would return with no memory of their assignments, often carrying detailed reports of places that didn't exist, describing phenomena that had no scientific basis. The entity's hunger had evolved beyond simple sustenance. It sought to understand the fundamental nature of human consciousness by consuming and replicating it. Small communities throughout the region began exhibiting signs of collective behavior that suggested their individual minds were being gradually absorbed into a larger network. Residents would speak in unison without apparent coordination. Children would draw identical pictures of places they had never seen. Entire populations would make simultaneous decisions without any form of communication. By the 1960s, the phenomenon had attracted the attention of researchers who operated in the shadowy intersection between government science and occult investigation. These individuals, working under classifications that officially didn't exist, began documenting what they termed the Appalachian Convergence. Their reports, heavily redacted and buried in archives that few would ever access, described a form of consciousness that was actively rewriting the laws of physics within an expanding geographical area. The entity's influence began manifesting in ways that challenged the very concept of linear time. Residents reported encountering versions of themselves from different time periods. Historical events would occur out of sequence. People would age backwards or experience decades of life in single days. The normal flow of cause and effect became unreliable within the entity's sphere of influence. Most concerning to the few researchers who maintained awareness of the situation was the entity's apparent ability to retroactively alter its own history. The original family's stories would change between tellings, not through faulty memory, but through actual historical revision. Documents would rewrite themselves. Genealogical records would shift to show different bloodlines, different pacts, different outcomes. The entity was not just consuming reality, but actively editing it to suit its evolving needs. The consciousness that had emerged from the family's collective bargains demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that went far beyond what any individual mind could possess. It began experimenting with large-scale emotional manipulation, generating fear, hope, love, and despair across entire populations, as a researcher might test chemical reactions. Suicide rates in certain areas would spike suddenly, then return to normal. Birth rates would fluctuate in patterns that corresponded to no known sociological factors. Marriage and divorce rates would shift in ways that suggested external orchestration. The entity's most ambitious project appeared to be the creation of what researchers termed cognitive dead zones. These were areas where human consciousness itself would become unstable. Visitors would report experiencing memories that weren't their own, speaking languages they had never learned, or possessing knowledge about subjects they had never studied. Some individuals would return from these zones claiming to be different people entirely, with personalities and skills that bore no resemblance to their previous selves. Scientific instruments began registering readings that defied known physics within the entity's territory. Magnetic fields would fluctuate in patterns that resembled brainwave activity. Gravitational anomalies would appear and disappear according to no predictable schedule. Time itself seemed to move at different rates in different locations, with some areas experiencing years of subjective time, while only minutes passed in the outside world. The entity's influence on local wildlife became increasingly dramatic. Animals would exhibit behaviors that suggested collective intelligence. Migratory patterns would change overnight. Predator and prey relationships would reverse without explanation. Most disturbing were reports of animals that seemed to be acting as extensions of the entity's consciousness, observing and reporting on human activities with an intelligence that far exceeded their natural capabilities. By the 1970s, the entity had begun what researchers privately termed the recruitment phase. Individuals with specific psychological profiles would be drawn to the region through seemingly natural circumstances. They would arrive as tourists, researchers, or job seekers, but would quickly become integrated into the entity's expanding network. These new additions would maintain their original personalities while simultaneously serving the entity's larger purposes. The recruitment process was subtle and apparently irresistible. Targeted individuals would experience a series of coincidences that would gradually lead them toward the Appalachian region. They would find job opportunities that seemed perfect for their skills. They would develop sudden interests in mountain hiking or local history. They would meet people who would invite them to visit the area. Once they arrived, the integration process would begin immediately. The entity's expansion was not random, but followed patterns that suggested strategic planning on a scale that encompassed decades or possibly centuries. It seemed to be selecting individuals who possessed skills or knowledge that would be useful for its long-term objectives. Scientists, artists, military personnel, and political figures would all find themselves drawn to the region and subsequently absorbed into the collective consciousness. Communication with the entity became increasingly difficult as its evolution accelerated. The few researchers who maintained contact reported that conversations would occur simultaneously across multiple time periods. Questions asked in the present would be answered by referencing events that had not yet occurred. The entity's responses would often come through multiple individuals speaking in perfect synchronization across vast distances. The entity's ultimate goals remained unclear, but its capabilities continued to expand at an alarming rate. It demonstrated the ability to influence events far beyond the Appalachian region through individuals who had been exposed to its influence and then returned to their original locations. These unwitting agents would make decisions that served the entity's purposes while believing they were acting according to their own free will. Weather manipulation became one of the entity's most visible abilities. Storms would appear and dissipate according to patterns that corresponded to the entity's activities. Droughts would end precisely when the entity required increased water levels. Seasonal changes would occur ahead of schedule or be delayed according to the entity's needs. The regional climate became a tool under the entity's direct control. The entity's influence on human reproduction became apparent through statistical analysis that revealed impossible patterns. Certain genetic combinations would appear with frequencies that defied natural probability. Children born within the entity's sphere of influence would demonstrate abilities that suggested genetic modifications that current science could not explain. The entity was not just recruiting existing humans, but actively shaping the development of future generations. Most disturbing of all was the entity's apparent ability to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions of reality. Researchers reported encounters with versions of the entity that existed in parallel timelines or alternate realities. These encounters suggested that the Appalachian convergence was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger process that spanned multiple versions of existence itself. The entity's true nature remained beyond human comprehension, but its impact on reality was undeniable. The Appalachian region had become a laboratory where the fundamental laws of physics, consciousness, and time were being systematically rewritten. What had begun as desperate families making bargains with supernatural forces had evolved into something that threatened the very nature of human existence. What remains most unsettling about these supernatural alliances is how they've adapted to the modern era. The digital age hasn't diminished their influence. Instead, it's provided new conduits for their expanding reach. In 1994, when the internet first connected rural Appalachian communities to the wider world, something unprecedented occurred. The collective consciousness that had been brewing in the mountains for over a century suddenly gained access to global networks, not through technology, but through the people who carried its influence beyond the region's borders. Social media platforms began experiencing unexplained phenomena in their early years. Users would report encountering profiles of people who didn't exist, yet seemed to know intimate details about their lives. These digital entities would appear in friend suggestions, offering cryptic advice or making eerily accurate predictions about users' futures. When investigated, the accounts would vanish, leaving no trace in server logs or databases. The pattern became more pronounced as platforms grew. Certain hashtags would trend without explanation, leading users to content that seemed designed to identify those experiencing personal crises. The desperate, the lonely, the financially ruined would find themselves drawn into online communities that offered solutions. These digital gathering places served as recruitment grounds, identifying potential candidates for the ancient bargains that had once required physical presence in the mountains. By the early 2000s, reports emerged of people receiving packages they hadn't ordered. Small items arrived with no return address: a piece of coal, a pressed flower, a photograph of a place they'd never been but somehow recognized. Recipients would experience vivid dreams of mountain paths and whispered offers. Many would find themselves planning trips to Appalachia, drawn by compulsions they couldn't explain. The influence manifested in subtler ways as well. Streaming services would recommend documentaries about Appalachian folklore to users who had never shown interest in the region. Music algorithms would introduce listeners to haunting melodies that seemed familiar despite being unrecorded. Search engines would autocomplete queries about mountain locations that didn't appear on any maps. Real estate markets in major cities began showing anomalous patterns. Properties purchased by individuals with no apparent connection to Appalachia would be transformed into gathering spaces. Basements would be excavated to unusual depths. Gardens would be planted with species that shouldn't survive in urban environments. Neighbors would report strange sounds emanating from these properties during new moon phases. The collective consciousness had learned to operate through human proxies, individuals who carried its influence while maintaining the appearance of normal lives. These carriers would establish businesses, join organizations, and integrate into communities far from the mountains. They served as nodes in an expanding network, each one capable of identifying and cultivating new candidates for the ancient contracts. Financial markets showed unexplained fluctuations that benefited certain investment groups. Environmental disasters would mysteriously spare properties owned by specific individuals. Political campaigns would receive anonymous donations that traced back to shell companies registered in remote mountain counties that had never seen industrial development. The most disturbing evidence came from missing persons reports. Since 2005, there's been a statistically significant increase in disappearances of individuals who had recently experienced major life crises. Job loss, divorce, death of loved ones, or financial ruin preceded their vanishing. Security cameras would capture them, leaving their homes voluntarily, often carrying small bags, as if going on brief trips. Their destinations were invariably traced to rural areas before the trails went cold. Those who returned from these unexplained journeys were fundamentally changed. They displayed newfound confidence, sudden financial windfalls, or remarkable recoveries from serious illnesses. When questioned, they would speak vaguely of finding exactly what they needed, of discovering that help was available to those willing to accept it on the right terms. The digital fingerprints of these returnees showed interesting patterns. Their online activity would shift dramatically. They would begin sharing content that seemed designed to identify others in crisis. Their social media posts would contain subtle references to opportunity, to ancient wisdom, to the idea that desperate times called for desperate measures. Communication networks began carrying messages that bypassed conventional channels. Text messages would appear on phones with no sender identification, containing coordinates or cryptic instructions. Email inboxes would receive invitations to events that hadn't been scheduled in locations that didn't officially exist. Voice messages would be left on answering machines, speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, but that recipients somehow understood. The phenomenon reached a tipping point during the 2008 financial crisis. As millions faced foreclosure and unemployment, the recruitment activity intensified dramatically. Online forums dedicated to financial survival began attracting moderators who offered unconventional solutions. Self-help websites would redirect users to resources that promised extraordinary results through traditional mountain wisdom. By 2010, the influence had established nodes in every major metropolitan area. Urban legends began circulating about places where desperate people could find help. Abandoned buildings in industrial districts, basements of certain businesses, back rooms of specific establishments. These locations served as modern equivalents of the ancient mountain clearings where the original bargains had been struck. The collective consciousness had evolved beyond its geographical origins. It no longer required physical presence in Appalachia to extend its influence. Instead, it had created a distributed network that could operate anywhere human desperation existed. The mountains remained the source, but the power now flowed through digital channels, financial systems, and human carriers who spread its influence across continents. What makes this modern manifestation particularly insidious is its invisibility. The supernatural elements have been replaced by seemingly natural phenomena. Stock market successes, networking opportunities, chance encounters that lead to prosperity. The bargains still require payment, but the costs are distributed across time and space in ways that obscure the connection to their supernatural origins. The families who made the original deals have become something like patron saints of this expanded network. Their names appear in corporate registrations, charitable foundations, and investment groups. Their descendants, or entities wearing their identities, serve as intermediaries in transactions that span the globe. They've become brokers of impossible solutions, facilitating exchanges between human desperation and the ancient hungers that feed on it. The most recent development has been the emergence of what researchers call cascade events. When multiple individuals in the same geographic area or social network accept these modern bargains, the effects compound exponentially. Entire communities can be transformed seemingly overnight. Crime rates plummet, economic prosperity surges, and social problems disappear. But the price is always paid elsewhere, in ways that maintain the balance the system requires. The digital age has not diminished the power of the original agreements made in those misty hollows. Instead, it has given that power global reach and infinite scalability. The mountains of Appalachia remain the heart of something vast and patient, something that has learned to thrive in humanity's interconnected world. And with each new connection, each new user, each new crisis, the network grows stronger, more sophisticated, and more capable of offering exactly what desperate people need, at prices they don't understand until payment comes due. Today, these ancient forces no longer require primitive cave rituals or blood sacrifices to expand their influence. Through generations of evolution, the supernatural pacts forged in Appalachian darkness have adapted to modern systems of power and control. The consciousness that once spoke through mountain stone now pulses through fiber optic cables, its hunger fed by data streams and digital transactions rather than physical offerings. The descendants of those original bloodlines have integrated seamlessly into contemporary society, occupying positions in technology corporations, financial institutions, and government agencies. They've learned to channel their inherited supernatural abilities through sophisticated networks that span continents, manipulating markets, elections, and public opinion with the same precision their ancestors use to control weather patterns and geological events. What began as desperate bargains in isolated mountain caves has transformed into a vast, interconnected web of influence that touches every aspect of modern civilization. The entities that once demanded blood now feast on human attention, emotional energy, and collective consciousness harvested through social media platforms, streaming services, and virtual reality systems. The mountains themselves have become nodes in this expanded network, their ancient power amplified by satellite arrays and communication towers built strategically on peaks where the original rituals took place. The consciousness that emerged from those early pacts has evolved beyond its physical origins, becoming something that exists simultaneously in digital space and primordial darkness. As humanity becomes increasingly dependent on technology and virtual experiences, the hunger of these ancient entities grows stronger. They've discovered that modern humans willingly surrender their privacy, their thoughts, and their very souls in exchange for convenience and connection. The same desperation that once drove mountain families to seek forbidden help now drives millions to accept terms of service without reading them, to share intimate details online, and to surrender their autonomy to algorithms designed by those who still remember the old bargains. The transformation is complete. What once required elaborate rituals and dangerous journeys into cursed caves now happens with the simple click of a button or the swipe of a screen. The ancient entities have achieved what they always sought: complete integration with human consciousness, ensuring their eternal hunger will never go unfed in an age where humanity itself has become the willing sacrifice.